Yes, we hit the record button because we have another dialogue with a conscious thought leader. And we had quite some dialogues with quite some interesting thought leaders. And I think Richard, however, sticks out because of his depth and breadth and length of experience, and you will see why. So I'll give you a very quick intro. Before I do that, the housekeeping, I invited everybody to quickly share where you call from, just to say hello, do that in the chat, and maybe add in what capacity or what function. You're invited to leave on the camera all the time. I think it gives more of a dialogue atmosphere. You are invited to switch it off if you feel more comfortable. Please make sure that you switch off your microphones for now. We will not control it because the whole purpose, those that are used to these dialogues, are to have a dialogue. So I'm here to moderate. I'm not really the interviewer. And we're going to kick it off with Richard with some questions, but very soon, please feel free to chip in. And there's actually two ways. The first one is use the chat function because we decided to use the open Zoom and not the webcast function. There's no Q&A. Use the chat function. And if you have a question, and I'm going to do some filtering and pre-vetting just to make sense it flows into the conversation. But at some point in time, we may as well just go, and then some of you may know that there's a virtual hand that you can raise. Or if I read your question, I may simply just hand over to you, to whoever raised the question, and you are able to voice it yourself. It doesn't have to be a question. We're here as well opening something like a debate, a conversation. So if it's more of a comment, your own experience, a twist you want to add to what you hear from Richard, feel free to do so. And with that, let's kick it off. So quickly, and I try to summarize this. It was not very easy, but I try to summarize it in a couple of short words. Here's my intro to Richard. So he's best known to conscious entrepreneurs and business leaders as creator and founder of the Barrett value system. I think it's equally known as the Barrett model. This is really what sticks out. I myself got trained on it and I got certified on it. Many other people may have known the model. Some of you may have used it. And we're going to double click a little bit on this. And it is actually something that has been adopted by organizations worldwide. But he goes back in starting a job in the World Bank. I found an interesting quote from himself that after, I don't know how many years in working in the transportation department, he realized that he's more about transformation than transportation. And this is where actually he began his journey into the world of transforming, elevating consciousness, and we'll double click a lot on that aspect, as well as helping companies, organizations, public as well as private, lately even entire countries to flourish and elevate their consciousness. We're going to extract, all of you can do that in parallel on Amazon and look up some books. We're going to give you a couple, which maybe are the more important ones. And lately, and we're going to talk about that too, he turned more, it's not philanthropic, but it's more giving and sharing by founding the so-called Barrett Academy and turned on teaching. And even more so, and I found that very interesting, he took up expressing his soul through painting. So a very rich life, and hasn't stopped at all because he's still exploring new horizons. And with that, I want to ask a quick first question for warm-up. In one of the interviews that I heard from you, this is on the Conscious Capitalists. It's a podcast from Raj Sodia and Timothy Henry. You're introduced as the maestro of values. So if you hear that, do you perceive that as an honor, or do you lately feel it's kind of limiting?
I don't think about it at all, really. But just to give you a little history on that, why they might have said that. I mean, I know Tim and I know Raj very well. They're good friends. I started working on values 25 years ago when hardly anybody was speaking about values. And I invented the model, the 7 levels of consciousness model. I invented a way of measuring consciousness by mapping values. And 25 years ago, I was practically the only one doing it. And nowadays, value is just not everywhere. And I feel a sense of gratification. I'm not into pride. I'm into more gratification for the fact that those ideas were picked up and are now actually worldwide. And at one point, nobody was really listening to me. And gradually, it took me about 4 or 5 years to build knowledge and writings and books which got people's attention. And so, yeah, I feel a sense of gratification that all of this information came through me. You know, I didn't invent it. It just came from my soul. And to have been chosen to bring this into the world feels like a privilege.
That's beautiful. We will talk more about soul. I found that to be a really important term in your work. You actually wrote 2 books which have a title, Talk About Soul. And here again, you quoted that it came through you as a soul. And the first question was a warm-up. Let me go actually then big and ask the big, almost looking back in your life kind of questions. So something that I picked up was you've studied organizational culture, psychology, spirituality, and the evolution of societal worldviews. Then we know that you created, explored, and developed several tools that have to do with assessing and curating values in people and organizations. Actually, lately, I said even in countries. And you've had so much engagement with people, so your practical life is so rich. The reason why I'm doing this very quick panopticon again is to ask you, if you had to condense it, like almost your life in the last 40 years doing what you do, could you summarize it in some quintessential learnings, which you think, wow, this is what it boils down to. If I had to give something along, almost like a legacy, these are the key takeaways. Very tough question, I know. What would that be?
Well, I think I would like to answer that question in maybe 2 or 3 ways, but very simply. Even when I was studying to be a civil engineer 60 years ago, I was interested in psychology and spirituality, and I followed my transportation engineer career up to the age of about 52, and I was very good at it. But all the time I'm studying psychology, I'm studying spirituality, and then I suddenly realized that I became bored with my career in transportation and realized that my interest was in transformation. And that's when I began the Barrett Value Center. And I spent 10 years developing that, and then 10 to 15 years writing books. I've just written my 14th book. And in the last 2 years, I became a portrait painter. So what's the thread? The thread is that my soul has been guiding me all the way on this journey, and it's been an amazing journey. I had an experience shortly after I left the World Bank because I felt the impulse to leave and do what I'd been doing for the last 20 odd years. I was giving a workshop in Boulder, Colorado on finding your mission in life. And on the second day, on the last day, somebody said, well, okay, well, what's your mission? And I had a very well-rehearsed affirmation, which was, I'm an internationally recognized speaker and author on personal and organizational transformation. Well, when the person asked me that question, I could not remember those words. I felt very embarrassed. And for about 6, I said, hang on a second. I closed my eyes, and out of my mouth came the words, I'm an architect of global transformation. Now, I'd never said those words ever. I was amazed by those words. But I knew, because I'd already written a book called A Guide to Liberating Your Soul. I know that was my soul speaking to me and through me. And I thought, well, okay, if that's the truth, I better just sit back and let this happen, because I'm not in charge here. I'm just a vehicle. I'm a vehicle for this entity, which I call my soul, to come into the world and to give its gifts. And that is if you want the most fundamental message for myself is that I am a soul. I don't have a soul. I am a soul, and that there are moments, well, throughout my whole life, when, but particularly the last 30 years, where I feel impulses to do something, impulses to say something. I receive kind of wisdom, and I've just written another book on soul-centered living, and basically I wrote that book in 2 months. It was amazing. I just sat there and took dictation effectively, or it just flowed through me onto the screen. So that's my big takeaway, is we are all actually have a deeper sense of who we are. We have an essence, which is the soul. And if you can connect with that, you will have a fulfilling life. And this applies. Understanding how that operates, I call that ego-soul dynamics, is the fundamental basis of leadership development. Understanding that interplay between the ego and the soul. And I can define the ego and the soul, but let me stop there for the moment, because it's easy for me to ramble on, and I don't want to ramble. I want to be concise.
So we just spoke about soul. It came up soul again, and it was obvious that this was important. And I actually want to first ask you for kind of a definition. Yes. How would you define soul? Is it identical to consciousness or not? And where this ought to lead at some point in time, you can comment on it right away, or we can double click after your initial answer is. What does it imply here, the audience mainly being conscious leaders, conscious entrepreneurs, investors, people that actually are part of the bigger conscious capitalism ecosystem? What does it mean for leaders? How do they learn, develop, and pick up being a soul? So that'll be the question I want to tee up with. Give us a quick definition first, and then let's go to the leadership aspect.
So for got nothing to do with religion. Okay, let's get that out of the way. And it has something to do with spirituality. Many people say I'm very spiritual. I know you have a particular spiritual tradition that you follow. Can I tell people what that is? Hello? Anyhow, can you all hear me?
Yes, fine.
Okay, so soul for me is we're actually energetic beings, and I think many of the famous scientists understand that. When we think we live in a material world, we actually live in an energetic world, and the soul is the energetic part of who I am, basically. When the body dies, that soul just continues in another dimension of existence. I call it the fourth dimension. You can call it what you like. And so, whereas the ego is the aspect of your psychology or your persona, which believes you're living in this material world and that you have needs, and that you have a basic need is survive. And so, where does the ego come from? I write about that in my books. I believe, for myself, and it seems to play out that way, that the ego was actually created very soon after you were born, because up to that point, being born, you were living in this field of oneness. And if you talk to very, very young children, they still inhabit that field of oneness. Actually, they move into a field of separation. And as you move into that field of separation, the ego grows and develops and thinks it's living in this material world, and thinks that of course, obviously, to live in this material world, you have to survive. And my understanding of that is that the soul creates the psychic entity called the ego in order to manage living in this material world. And the ego takes its job very seriously, and it manages to live in this world by developing how to respond to situations, and builds up fear. And that's one of the key aspects of the ego, is that it can be very fearful. And the fears that you learn in the first 20 years of your life, while your mind and brain are growing and developing, tend to stay with you for the rest of your life. And personal mastery is all about mastering those fears so you can let them go. As I say, let go and let soul. Because the soul doesn't know fear. The soul has no fears when the ego has all the fears. And so letting go of your fears is a fundamental aspect of personal mastery. And there are three, my model, you refer to the Barrett model, the first 3 stages of development, which are occur during the moment you're born and the age of about 21, when your brain becomes fully developed, are early on. It's all about you learn the fears about not having enough, and then you learn the fears about not being loved enough, and then you learn the fears about not being enough. And those 3 stages of development, which go from the first 4 or 5 years of life, the next 10 years of life, and then teenage years, and that's what you learn. And then that's it. You pick that up from your parents, you pick that up from your culture, and then many people don't get past that stage of development. They never individuate and self-actualize, and they spend the rest of their lives basically trying to get their ego needs met, their basic needs met. And my work is all about helping people to move beyond that, and helping organizations to move beyond that, and helping nations to move beyond that, and creating the training that allows that to happen.
Tell us a little bit, let's switch to being very practical. And what is actually the key tool? I'm referring to the Barrett model, 7 stages of consciousness. And I know a lot of thinking of the stages went into it. Maybe you can give us a little insight how you develop the model, what are the deeper insights behind the model. And then for the audience who are not familiar, I'm sure you've done that a million times, explain in a very condensed, practical way. How does that model work? How does that actually practically apply to companies?
Well, okay, so I've got 18 e-learning courses which explain all of that. But anyhow, let's do the quick version. So how did it all start? Well, it all started by this impulse to write a book called A Guide to Liberating Your Soul in 1995. And as I was writing that book, I really became enthralled by Maslow's work, Abraham Maslow, and his hierarchy of needs. And then I realized that if you could blend Vedic philosophy, which looks at the higher levels of consciousness, with Maslow, you have a 7 levels model. And that's what I created, the 7 level of consciousness. And then I had the insight, having created that model, to say, well, how do I know where I am on that model? And I thought, well, what are your values? And then I realized that each stage, each level of consciousness, there are particular values. So survival values at level 1, or relationship values at level 2, self-esteem values, and so on, into the higher levels, the Vedic levels of connection to the universe. And so that was the first stage, the model. Then the values fit in, so you can actually measure consciousness of individuals and in organizations. And that's what I did for the next 5-10 years. It really took off everywhere in the world. And within 5 years, I was working in Australia and Canada and USA and England. And the model is still growing and developing. Now, the model then taught me something interesting. I realized that if you actually measure, if you include in your value list the first 3 levels of consciousness, what I call entropic values, like an organization at level 3, which is self-esteem. Bureaucracy is a entropic value. Blame is at level 2, an entropic value. So if you give people a list of values, say, this is who I am, pick 10 values. This is how my organization operates, pick 10 values. This is how I'd like it to operate, pick 10 values. In the middle column, where people are able to pick positive and potentially limiting words, you can actually, if you add up the number of votes for those potentially limiting values, like hierarchy, bureaucracy, etc., you can measure something called cultural entropy. And you can also measure personal entropy in leaders. And this is the amount of fear-driven energy that's showing up in the organization or showing up in the individual. So So the model began teaching me. I didn't invent the entropic values in the beginning. I invented the consciousness level. Then I put values to the consciousness level. Then I added entropic values. And then next, I realized that these 7 levels of consciousness actually represented 7 stages of psychological development. And you could apply these stages of psychological development to an individual, an organization, a nation, and to any group of people. You could apply these stages of development, which then led me into the whole work of ego-soul dynamics, and that fits into the model. So the model has been evolving, or helped me to evolve my thinking over the past 15 or 20 years. And now I really focus on that deeper aspect. I have a fellowship program, and on my website you'll find these different e-learning courses and videos. I focus on that, the fundamental aspect of who you are as an individual in your personal life and as a person in an organizational setting or in a cultural setting or a national setting. And yeah, so that's the story. And it's been a fascinating journey of learning and a fascinating journey of writing and getting insights, which I'm quite astounded, actually.
When I used your model, very little, there's 3 things that I found very appealing. One is the 7 scales, the very clear scheme and which kind of values belong where. I really like that it's a matter of balance. It's not that you only should strive for the 7.
Absolutely. Higher is not definitely better.
Exactly. It's a matter of balance. And the last aspect which I liked about it is that you compare in these 3 aspects, what is the culture that we perceive, what is the culture that we want, and what is the culture that I personally strive for and live. And when you think about culture, and I'm sure you've accompanied, initiated, developed many companies in their effort to actually use your model to develop culture, with or without your model, independent of your model, what have you learned as advice to people here in the audience? What cultural development or cultural transformation programs, and there's an endless sea of companies that strive for that, under which conditions do they work and which conditions don't they work?
So the culture of an organization is a reflection of the leadership consciousness, and particularly the consciousness of the leader. So what it boils down to is, where is the leader and the leadership team on this consciousness scale? And we can measure the culture of the organization, but we can actually measure where people are, leaders and individuals, on this scale. And so wherever the leader is on this, in this model, that's what actually shows up in the organization. If you want to change the culture, you either have to change the leaders or the leaders have to change. It's a very simple formula. Changing culture, either change the leaders or change the leader in the sense of having new leaders, or have the leader change. Now, what I have found, and I've been working all over the world, is that some leaders like the idea of changing the culture, but do not like the idea of changing themselves. And so it's a bit of it doesn't really work unless the leader is prepared to go through this journey of self-actualization. And as I now realize in the last few years, that this journey of self-actualization is all about the balance between ego and soul. And whereas ego is like the fear-driven energy, and the soul is a love-driven energy. And, and conscious capitalism wants to link into that upper part. It wants to let go of the fear-driven energy, makes profit the fundamental basis of organization. So that's why I was drawn to conscious capitalism, because being conscious means that you need to consider other people. You need to consider the environment. And these are the high levels of consciousness. The ego isn't concerned. The ego just wants to be powerful. It wants to be rich, and it wants to be important. And, that's it. And then the ego is satisfied, but actually the ego is never satisfied, because it always wants to be richer, it wants to be more powerful. And if you look at, politics, you see very often in the political arena, you see that. You see that in particular, the major countries of the world are all led by ego-driven leaders who never got their childhood needs met and are still trying to get all those needs met, 50 years later. And unfortunately for the rest of us, these people, in some cases, they get elected. In other cases, they don't. Now, why do these ego-driven people get elected? Because the leader you elect in a democracy represents the average level of consciousness of the nation. And so where you've got an ego-driven leader, you've got a large population, a majority of them, which are also ego-driven. Okay.
And what does it tell us about the US?
Well,
anybody's
talking
guess.
About the USA, actually, but
exactly. Anybody's guess.
You said it. All right. But you can say the same about Russia. I mean, Putin had a terrible childhood. I'm not trying to make excuses for him, but his whole childhood was about survival. And he had threats everywhere, and that's what he sees in the world. He hasn't got past the third stage of development, nor has Donald Trump. And our British friend with the white floppy hair, he was the same.
Let me double click. Some questions coming in the chat. I'm going to go to them in a second. Let me double click and just ask again for even more practicality on the culture evolution. You mentioned something which in other contexts I have heard as the consciousness of the organization can only be as evolved as the consciousness of the leader. And you clearly testify that. And I'm trying to be extreme in my question to get to a point. Does that actually mean that the typical grand, everybody involved, posters on the wall, you need to live it versus the leaders, all these cultural programs, the way they're typically driven, are useless? And as you quoted before, what it really comes down to, develop the leader and the leadership team. So what that would mean that the majority of everybody engaged, and this is the values you need to live versus starting with a leader, are actually useless in your experience.
Totally useless, total waste of time. Now, we talk about having a leadership development program for these select few people who are at the top of the organization. Well, okay, that's well and good, but for me, that also is not using money effectively. I believe everybody in an organization needs to have available to them a personal transformation program, and not focus all of the money on the precious few. Focus it on the whole organization, because there's one thing that everybody wants, and that's they want to grow, and they want to grow and develop, and they want to grow and develop so that they can, move up and get a higher salary or get a better job. And so when you provide a program where everybody can grow and develop, then you have an amazing organization which people will love and will bring themselves fully to work, because it's part of their journey into self-actualization. They may not know that, but they know they feel good when they have these revelations about who they are and how they interact, not just with other people work with, but with their spouses and with their children. I mean, you can't be two people. The person you are at home is also the person you are at work. And if you try to make that different, it's really tiring.
It creates friction. Friction.
So I believe in having programs for everybody, and from that the leaders will emerge. I've done enough programs now to see that when you give this type of education to people who would otherwise never get a chance to evolve and grow, some of them are just like take to it, as we say in English, like ducks to water. And these leaders, these now are the emergent leaders you would never have found if you just simply done a search for people who had been in a business school. I mean, that's just a waste of time. What you want are people who are emotionally developed and have the ability to understand how they operate and how other people operate. On my fellowship program, we have two young women. I say young, they're in their early 30s or mid 30s. They have high positions in two well-known organizations. And I say to them, well, so what is your secret? And they say, both of them said the same thing, is that we just care about our people. Leadership is easy. We just care about our people. Now, one of the things, because they understand the stages of development, and another practice which I call evolutionary coaching, which looks at the stages of development, they can understand the people when people come with their problems. They understand where they are on that scale and how to help them to move to the next level. And so that's why, and you have to be adept at that to be a really good leader, because you become a role model.
There's a question. There's a question actually from the chat which fits nicely in this, and let's double click on it. It's from Rita, and she asks, these stages in the evolution make me think of ecosystem to ecosystem analogy. So moving from egocentric to more a culture of serving. And the question, to double click on exactly what you said, is what are different levers or resources, maybe even enablers for consciousness advancement? So if a leader and people that want to help that person develop, what are typical settings, resources, environments that you think these are the kind of the success factors to have you advance? Because I would hope that you confirm everybody can advance given they're willing to advance along this ladder.
So I'm not quite clear on the question. Are you talking about the ecosystem or the type of training people want to go through?
Actually, the question alludes to both. So,
okay. All right. So let me tackle the training program in two parts. One of in the latter years, I've been studying the evolution of consciousness of nations, and it's very clear to me that they follow the same pattern as the stages of psychological development. Now, the Scandinavian nations are most advanced, and you see that in their culture and the values that show up in their culture. And there's way ahead in many ways of Northern Europe and USA, not some Canada are already on that path too. Now, so the question is, how did the Scandinavian nations become so evolved and have such high value? Well, it goes back to around the 1850s, and the very bright sparks in that area, the Scandinavian area at that point, said the Industrial Revolution is coming. We're basically a rural society. We need to teach our people how to be in a completely different environment. We need a sort of personal transformation program, and it was called Bildung. Bildung, there's a whole book about it. And so in those Nordic countries, they had a public set of courses for young people to go through, which actually was all about personal mastery. It was about individuation, it was or Carl Jung would call it. And they ran those programs from 1850 to the end of the Second World War. So over 100 years. And the whole culture changed and became more advanced because then moved people out of the ego stages of development into the stage that is the entry into soul consciousness. Now, I write about that in one of my books, and also the Humanity Awareness Initiative. It's a website. I explain all of this, how all of this happened. And so that's one answer to the question. at a mass level, you can change a whole nation if you have a program and you run it for long enough, and that was like over 100 years, you can change the culture. Now, for individuals and people working in organizations, that's the piece that I've really tackled with what I call my legacy program. Now, if you go to the Barrett Academy website, you'll find my legacy program. It's 18 e-learning courses and 18 videos that explain personal transformation, organizational transformation, and societal transformation. And the depth of material in those courses gets down to that ego-soul dynamic level. And, you know, you can call ego and soul whatever you want, but it's about that. What's in it for me, based in opposition to what's best for the common good. And that, you know, that's the basis of cultural capitalism. It's like, how do we shift from what's in it for me to what's best for the common good? And that's why I felt a strong affinity to cultural capitalism when it all began, 10, 15 years ago. And I was living in America then and was a very interested observer and went to many of the early meetings on cultural capitalism, spoke at many of them, not so much lately. And that's only because, well, I don't know, I've been focusing on other things like my painting.
For example. Nice. Speaking of conscious capitalism, so I'm not here to test and repeat and compare, not at all, to what Raj and many of the practitioners call a conscious leader. I'm asking for your own definition. If people ask, so what makes a conscious leader?
Yeah, well, first of all, you have to be aware. It's quite simple. You have to be aware of how your behaviors and actions affect other people. And not only that, but be aware of how your behaviors and actions affect your health. Because what goes on in the mind shows up in the body. And, you know, if you get into ill health, the energetic source is the ill health in the mind, the lack of alignment in the mind, which is, I mean, there may be other factors, but so it's about being aware of how your actions and behaviors impact other people and also impact your personal health. And when you're conscious, you realize that you want to be able to influence other people and general society and your health in the best way possible. And that is by being aware of how you operate in the world. As simple as that.
This is interesting. Is there anything, if you think about conscious culture, stakeholder integration, and purpose, and I know you've done a lot of work on purpose. So I'm here again quoting the 4 pillars of conscious capitalism. And again, this is not about comparing or, you know, putting on that scheme, but is there anything else you would highlight as that what makes a company conscious? Conscious leadership is key. That became very clear in all your work and what you explained. Conscious leadership is key. Any other element you found?
Well, the question I think is how does a conscious leadership trickle down, not trickle, but flow down into the way that people operate in the organization? And obviously, the first trickle down is among a leadership team. And so let's say you've got the leader or the leaders, and then how does that leadership team interact with each other? Are they doing it consciously? Are they doing what I mean by consciously? Are they doing it from the higher levels of consciousness where they care about each other? And also, are they able to speak their truth to each other? You know, because there are ways of expressing yourself which are conscious, and there are ways of expressing yourself which are not conscious. For example, has anybody in this group here ever been angry? Well, you know, that's not conscious. Being angry is not conscious. It's like letting the subconscious take over your subconscious ego beliefs take over your actions, and you get angry. Well, what is anger? Anger is simply you don't feel you're getting your needs met. And so if you're not getting your needs met, there are different ways to tackle that. And one of the ways to tackle not getting your needs met is a conscious way, and is a look, I notice right now in this meeting that I'm beginning to feel angry. Now, why am I feeling angry? I'm feeling angry because I'm not getting my needs met. I'm just saying I'm not getting my needs met. Now, I own my anger. I own the fact that I'm not getting my needs met. And you are not upsetting me. I'm upsetting myself by the thoughts that I'm having, because other people can't upset you. Other people can't upset you. Well, what happens is an old belief is triggered that upsets you about, I don't have enough, I'm not loved enough, and I'm not enough. And so once you understand that other people can't upset you, then you're on the way to being conscious, because you're creating your own reality through your thoughts and beliefs, and particularly the thoughts and beliefs of the fear that you learn during your childhood and parental and cultural conditioning. Now that is conscious. Now, if that isn't showing up in your leadership team, well, you've got a problem, because you're not really being conscious. So it's really, there's a lot of personal mastery involved in being conscious. And people, many leaders, people in leadership, I've seen this, I've worked some of the biggest banks around the world, that the leadership team, it's hard to convince them all. And sometimes when the leader announces, look, we're going on this values-driven path, you have to get on board or leave, and some leave because they can't handle it. And I've seen it in ones that don't leave, and they spoil the whole thing, because they're constantly operating from this ego base of competition, fear, survival, wanting to influence things. They don't know how to listen, because and I teach them a technique for listening, which is when you're in a group of people, it's called circle time. I learned this in Sweden. But you have an agenda for the meeting, and you set up the agenda and you say, well, let's talk about X. All right. So everybody, now we go around the room, everybody has 2 minutes to talk about X. Okay. Whatever they think. And that means they know they've got 2 minutes, and they know you're going to go around again and again. So they can listen. They can listen to what people are saying, because what happens generally when in a meeting is people don't listen because they want to get their point across. Okay, so they don't listen to what's going on. They just look for opportunities to push the other people down and get their idea out. That's the ego. Now, in this circle time thing, we all go around, we express our point of view, and we listen, because we know we're going to go around again. So now, because I've listened and I've expressed my point of view, and I realize that the fellow sitting next to me, or the lady sitting next to me, had a better idea, I'm able to say so. I mean, well, actually, I know when it came to my turn the second time around, I said, well, actually, I was very influenced by what George just said. And I'm modifying my, you're not allowed to comment as you go around. You just go around for 2 minutes. Each every person, everybody goes around. You can pass if you want to, and you keep going around. And what happens is you get to a consensus of either a polarization of consensus, if you see what I mean, or a real consensus, like this is the way to go, or it's either this or that, But it's a fascinating tool for taking this ego-driven, I've got to influence and get my idea out of the team. Now, the team has to be able to operate consciously if the whole organization is going to operate consciously. And people have to understand this is how meetings are conducted, where everybody gets an opportunity and to say something. Now, there are people in every team who, I won't say they're shy, but they don't really want to express themselves. Well, with this method of circle time, everybody gets a chance to express themselves, and they get a chance to say pass. Yeah, that's just a practical tool I use.
Yeah, I want to elevate the discussion. We have 11 minutes left. And
Oh my gosh, what 11?
yeah, it's fine for now. And you mentioned a couple times throughout the last 50 minutes, ego versus soul. We started there. I related to the two books that have soul in the title. One I actually have here, What My Soul Told Me, The Soul-Driven Organization. Actually, we had two dialogue in partners here in the last year. One was Peter Blom, co-founder and longtime CEO of Triodos Bank, one of the leading ethical banks. And he referred to their own culture as the soul of the company. So he even used the word and made a difference. And another person, the founder of the Conscious Business Institute, who referred as well to the soul that came, that he actually connected to in a similar way that you referred to. So I want to hit this point home because you refer at some point in time in some other work, I read it or heard it, to soul-based person development. And I think you refer to 3 specific values, and I would like you to comment on those so that people here that want to resonate with that. How do I actually develop being a soul, being an authentic being? I think one was self-expression. There was one that had to do with connection, and another one was contribution. Can you comment on the development of a soul as a conscious act?
Yeah. So let me just quickly go back to my first book was called, and I was still at the World Bank then, called, what was it called? I've got it here. It's so long ago. A Guide to Liberating Your Soul. I was at the World Bank, and then I was still at the World Bank, and I wrote a second book called Liberating the Corporate Soul, where I explained this methodology for measuring and gave examples. And I've written 2 books since that built on them. Now, my more recent understanding of soul, as to get back to your second point of your question, is what is the soul want to do? What are the desires of the soul? The ego has needs and the soul has desires. The difference between needs and desires, when your needs are not met, you get angry and upset. Whereas when the soul's desires are not met, you get sad and you may get depressed. This is an interesting way of looking at depression when it's and I've written about it a lot in A New Psychology of Human Well-Being. That depression is just the sadness of the soul at not being able to fulfill its desires. Now, your question is, what are those desires? And I'm going to answer that right now. There are 3 desires. The first is self-expression. Now, by that, I mean, if you could pick up that word, I think that the essence is creativity, self-expression. Now, everybody has a unique self and unique gifts and a unique talents. And self-expression is bringing those out. It's actually the gifts of the soul, self-expression. The next desire of the soul, having found its gifts and talents and putting them out in the world, is to make a difference. Many people want to make a difference, but the essential part is you can't make a difference if you can't connect people. If you don't have emotional intelligence, you can't connect. And so that's the second desire of the soul, is connection. So self-expression, connection, and then finally, at the highest stage of development, is contribution. And that is being able to not just make a difference, which is where empathy is involved, but moving to contribution, which comes from a sense of compassion, where you actually do something to make the world a better place. Now, it doesn't have to be big, and it doesn't have to be small. My mum and I, my dad died when I was 17. My mum and I had no money. I went off to university. I got a grant, and she went off to work in the local chapel as a cleaner and the lady who arranged flowers. And in the latter years of my life, of my mum's life, from about 70 to about 85, she lived to be 100.
Wow.
She, without any education or anything, in a little community, she became the person who organized the flowers for the chapel for weddings and funerals and kept the chapel was spotlessly clean. That was her contribution. Now, everybody's sitting in this room, we've got bigger ideas, but that was my mum's small life. And yet, she found her creativity and self-expression by studying flower arranging when she was 50 years old. She found her way to make a difference by making that chapel absolutely beautiful. And that was her contribution. And she lived to be 100. So when you're able to self-express, connect, and contribute, it fills your life with an energy, soul-driven energy. I mean, I hesitate to say this, and because I'm still not quite sure, but I'm going to be 80 next year. I'm still full of passion. I'm still full of energy. I'm still full of creation.
It shows.
And, never missing an opportunity. This is the standard of portrait painting that I've learned to do in 2 years.
Beautiful.
And so 77, I'm learning I'm building a new career. And I didn't start this work that we're talking about here until I was 52. So, and all I've done is simply follow the instructions of my soul. That's all I've done. I haven't had to strive to do these things. They've just flowed through me because I surrendered to my soul.
Let me ask one
thing to what my instructions are.
Let me bring in one word that a user on the chat is asking for, which is love. You speak to soul, you speak to the highest values, you speak about caring. That was very, very important. And just in all shortness, is that equal? Is it a facet of love? Is that discrete? Because many people look at love as the single highest value.
Love is I don't know where even to put it on the 7 stages, 7 levels of consciousness. It's such an all-encompassing aspect of life. Love is an expression of oneness, deep oneness, and you can limit that love to one other person, you can limit it to your family, you can limit it to your community, but actually it's much bigger than that, because it's the energy that drives it's the energy that drives all the positive things that are going on in the world. It is it's a fundamental energy of the heart, okay? I've noticed, and this is just an anecdote, isn't it? I've noticed that when people have heart attacks and go in for operations and things, after they come out with a whole different way of being and an increase in love. So, it's like the heart attack is symbolic of not having enough love in your life. And if you can fill your life with love, if you can fill your heart with love, my gosh, what else is there? That's all there is.
Beautiful, beautiful. Let me invite you in the last 2 minutes for a question, and I'm losing here 2 questions which came on the chat. One had to do, it said, is there hope? The other one was looking for, if you look out in the world, what do you see? Let me be more specific, what I'm interested in. What you describe is a personal, which then translates into an organizational, even countrywide evolution up into actually 7 stages. Do you get a sense that the way people, organizations, countries develop, that we're developing it in a good, hopeful direction and moving up this ladder? Or, I don't want to blame Trump or voters for that, but do you see a lot of momentum which actually is making it much, much more difficult and less people striving towards that direction? That would be looking into the future, applying your wisdom.
I've studied this question a lot. I've written a couple of books on nations, worldview dynamics and the well-being of nations. Latest one. And then another earlier book, Love, Fear, the Destiny of Nations. The culture you find in a country is a reflection of the consciousness of that country. And it's a question, really a question of, are the people in their country, getting their needs met? Are the masses getting their needs met? And that's what separates the Scandinavian countries from most other countries, is they developed a culture where they take care of those basic needs for everybody. And that allows the culture to evolve. Now, there's a bit of a hiccup in Sweden and one or two of the other countries, because with their wonderful consciousness of saying, come on in, we will, all the refugees from, we will, you can come and live here. What they didn't calculate was that those people came with the culture of places where they came from. And this is where I have these 7 worldviews and the evolution of worldviews. People in Scandinavia are operating on people awareness. People in Northern Europe tend to operate from the next one below, nation awareness, and then below that is, wealth awareness, and below that is nation awareness. Now, nation awareness was rampant about 100 years ago in most of Europe. America generally, not Canada, but USA operates from wealth awareness. We have a lot of that in the UK because we call all our common holidays, they used to be Christian holidays, now they're called bank holidays. So the idea of wealth awareness is alive and well in the UK. These are all different worldviews. And so there has been an evolution. If you look back over 10,000 years, there's been a significant evolution of consciousness around the world in different nations. Now, we're in a period of hiccup, huge hiccup, where the people who got left behind, they were the rich, got all their needs met, and the poor got left behind. And that's absolutely true in the USA. And so now they're kind of catching up. They have to have programs that allow these people to catch up and have more equality and more care for the underprivileged. And it's not happening as much as it should be. Well, the only way forward is for it to happen. Now, let's talk about hope finally.
Please, last sentence.
Last sentence. Okay. I just did a little investigation into hope recently, and I realized that without hope, there's no motivation. And some of you here may be looking at the world and going, oh my God, what a place, and feeling very dispirited. So you've got to move into hope, and you've got to look for all the positive signs, because that is what will motivate you. Without hope, we are not motivated. We have to have hope to be motivated.
Beautiful. Let me add, I'm a born German, a German saying, which you may know, which goes, hope is the last aspect of us that dies.
Yeah.
Until you have hope,
I didn't know
die.
That.
Yeah. Die Hoffnung stirbt zuletzt.
Okay.
Beautiful. Thanks, Richard. It's
You're
up.
welcome.
I see people, if you want to go quickly, show your face and do a little bit of waving to Richard. This was beautiful. Thanks a lot. I loved it. We could have kept on talking, and Richard actually was generous enough to actually offer we could do this again, which we may in 2025. Was this again? Thanks, Richard. This was beautiful, very inspiring. Thanks for the audience for your participation. We'll talk to Tim Kelly in roughly 6 to 7 weeks. And Richard is called the Master of Values. Tim Kelly is known as the Guru of Purpose.
Yeah, I know Tim.
Exactly. So
yeah, he's really a guru of purpose. But I've got a question you can ask him, David. How does purpose relate to soul? Ask him that question.
Noted. Noted. Thanks for that. Have a good evening, everybody, and maybe hopefully talk to you again in 6 to 7 weeks. Bye now.